The middle of the 14th century, Europe was living through a fragile peace. Small villages, crowded cities, and busy trade routes connected people more than ever before. But no one knew that something unseen, something carried quietly across oceans and continents, was about to change the fate of the world forever. It began with ships. Merchant ships arriving from the east, their sails torn, their crews sick, their decks eerily silent. When the first boats docked in Mediterranean ports, people rushed to unload goods, spices, fabrics, precious cargo, not realizing that death itself had traveled with them. As the year 1347 unfolded, Europe remained unaware of the shadow racing toward it. Along busy trade routes, ships carried spices, silk, and death. When a fleet of Genoese trading vessels reached the port of Messina, the people of Sicily witnessed a nightmare. Sailors staggered off the ships, covered in dark swellings, painful buboes that oozed blood and pus. Most of the crew were already dead. The few survivors collapsed on the docks, unable to speak. Within days, the sickness tore through Messina. Families barricaded themselves inside their homes, hoping the plague would pass them by. Priests refused to perform last rites. Doctors, powerless and terrified, fled the city. But the Black Death did not stay contained. Ships escaping Sicily unknowingly carried the plague to every major port in the Mediterranean: Genoa, Venice, Marseille, Barcelona. Every arrival marked the beginning of another tragedy. By early 1348, the disease erupted across southern France. Entire villages disappeared within weeks. Merchants abandoned trade roads. Kings issued desperate decrees. Yet nothing could stop the invisible force spreading from town to town. People whispered that the end of the world had begun. Some believed poisoned air miasma was killing them. Others searched for someone to blame: foreigners, travelers, even their own neighbors. But the plague cared for no boundary, no prayer, no superstition. It swept across Europe with a speed the continent had never witnessed. While panic spread, one terrifying truth became clear. This was not a simple sickness. It was a force that could reshape civilizations. The plague did not strike all at once. At first, it crept quietly, one dying traveler here, one abandoned house there. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. Across European villages, people began noticing a terrifying pattern. Those who fell ill in the morning were often dead by nightfall. Fever surged suddenly, burning the body from the inside. Victims trembled uncontrollably, their mouths drying like desert sand. Within hours, dark swellings, called buboes, appeared under the arms, on the neck, and in the groin. They were large, agonizing, and filled with infection. To the people of the 14th century, these swellings were not just a physical horror, they were a sign that death had already chosen its victim. Families were forced to watch their loved ones collapse, unable to offer help, because touching the infected often meant sharing their fate. As the plague spread, a dreadful silence settled over towns. Marketplaces emptied, church bells tolled endlessly for the dead, and fear began to replace every normal part of life. People whispered that no one was safe, not the rich, not the poor, not even the clergy or doctors. The disease did not care about status or faith. It moved like a shadow, unpredictable and merciless. And worse, no one understood what caused it. Some blamed poisoned wells. Some blamed foul air drifting from swamps. Others whispered that it was a punishment from the heavens. But while people argued about the cause, the plague continued its march, village by village, town by town, transforming Europe into a land of fear and mourning. In the early months of 1347, something strange began to happen in the port cities of the Mediterranean. Ships arrived heavy with cargo, but eerily silent. When the dock workers boarded them, they found crews lying motionless, many already dead, others burning with fever, whispering in delirium. Most chilling of all, the bodies were covered with dark swellings, large, painful lumps under the arms, on the neck, and in the groin, what people would soon call the black buboes. No one knew what this meant. Some believed it was a curse. Others thought it was punishment from God. A few suspected poisoned wells or foreign enemies spreading disease, but the truth was worse, much worse. The Black Death had begun its silent march. By late 1347, it spread to Constantinople, Alexandria, and the islands of the Mediterranean. Within weeks, entire neighborhoods fell into fear. Merchants fled, priests refused last rites, and families locked themselves inside their homes. People tried anything to escape, but the plague moved faster than any ship or horse. In every infected city, the same horrors repeated. Sudden chills, explosive fever, vomiting dark spots spreading under the skin, and within 2 or 3 days, silence. The world had never seen death move this quickly, and this was only the beginning. By early 1348, the Black Death had crossed into mainland Europe. It entered through Sicily, then climbed north through the Italian peninsula like a fire no one could extinguish. In Florence, chroniclers wrote that funerals became impossible. Bodies lay in the streets, abandoned by friends and even family. Gravediggers refused to work unless paid enormous sums, and even then, many died before finishing their task. From Italy, the plague surged into France, Spain, and the Balkans. Trade routes that once carried silk and spices now carried death. Horsemen galloped between towns begging for help, but the sickness always outran the warnings. In Paris, doctors burned herbs in the streets to purify the air. In Aragon, people carried flowers and vinegar-soaked cloths to protect themselves. None of it worked. The disease traveled with terrifying speed, from Marseille to Avignon, from Genoa to Lyon, from Barcelona to Valencia. Sometimes it reached a new town before word of the previous outbreak had even arrived. People looked at the horizon with fear, expecting death to appear at any moment. And still, the plague marched on. As winter crept into Europe, the plague no longer stayed confined to ports. Caravans from the East merchants fleeing the coast and soldiers returning from campaigns all unknowingly carried the infection further inland. By early 1348, the Black Death reached the great trade routes of Europe. Small villages were the first to fall. People woke to the sound of coughing, choking, crying. By evening, half the village would lie still in their homes. Travelers who passed through described empty streets, abandoned carts, and doors left wide open, as if families had simply vanished overnight. In towns and cities, panic spread even faster than the disease. Doctors, unable to explain the sudden wave of death, turned to desperate measures, burning herbs in every room, cupping and bloodletting, even drilling holes in the buboes to release the poison. But nothing worked. Every attempt only deepened the dread filling Europe's streets. The plague showed no mercy, not to the poor, not to the wealthy, not even to the nobility locked behind castle walls. It became clear this was not a disease of the body alone. It was a terror striking the heart of an entire continent. As the plague pushed deeper into Europe, it moved with a kind of terrifying rhythm. Slow at first, then suddenly unstoppable. By early 1348, the disease had crossed into southern France and northern Italy. Cities that had survived wars, famines, and centuries of hardship collapsed in a matter of weeks. Monks who copied scriptures for a lifetime left their monasteries deserted. Doctors who believed they understood the body realized they understood nothing at all. In Florence, one of the richest cities in Europe, streets once filled with laughter and trade became silent. People abandoned their homes with meals still warm on the tables. Shops were left open, untouched, as if the entire city had simply vanished. Those who stayed behind spoke of a chilling sound at night. Not horses, not merchants, but the creaking wheels of death carts moving through empty streets. Wooden carts loaded with bodies were pulled toward mass graves, pits dug so quickly that families no longer knew where their loved ones rested. And still, the plague did not slow. It climbed north through the Alps, followed the trade routes like a shadow, and slipped into towns that believed they were too far, too hidden, too protected. But nothing was far enough. Wherever the Black Death arrived, life paused, hope dimmed, and Europe felt itself sinking into a darkness deeper than anything it had ever known. Now the dangerous moment was coming. As the plague spread inland, terror grew even faster than the disease itself. Travelers carried the infection from port cities to villages, castles, and busy trade routes. A simple handshake, a shared cup, even a breath near an infected person could mean death. Doctors were helpless. They wore long, bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, believing the scented air would protect them. It didn't. Nothing did. By early 1348, entire towns in Italy were collapsing, bells tolling without pause, shops abandoned, streets filled with carts carrying the dead. Chroniclers wrote of parents abandoning their children and children leaving their parents to die alone. Not out of cruelty, but out of terror. In some regions, half the population disappeared within months, and the plague showed no mercy. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, death treated everyone the same. Europe was only beginning to understand the nightmare they were facing, but the Black Death was already spreading toward France, Spain, and deep into the heart of the continent. The darkest chapter was far from over. As the plague tightened its grip across Europe, daily life collapsed into chaos. Markets emptied, church bells rang endlessly for the dead, and entire villages fell eerily silent, sometimes leaving not a single survivor. Doctors were powerless. Many wore the famous plague doctor mask, filled with herbs and spices, but the mask offered no real protection. They did not understand that the true killers were tiny infected fleas and the rats that carried them. Meanwhile, fear spread faster than the disease itself. Parents abandoned sick children. Friends refused to visit one another, and travelers were chased away from city gates with stones and spears, desperate citizens screaming, "Stay away! Don't bring death here!" Superstitions grew wild. Some blamed bad air. Others blamed astrological signs. And mobs formed to hunt down groups they believed had angered God. But none of this stopped the plague. Every day, black carts moved through the streets, filled with bodies taken to mass graves, where dozens were buried at once. For many, hope was disappearing, because no one knew when or if the nightmare would end. As winter deepened, the plague showed no sign of slowing. In fact, it changed. What had once been a sickness, carried quietly by rats and fleas, now began spreading from person to person. People no longer needed to touch infected clothing or be bitten by a hidden flea. A single breath in a crowded street, a whispered prayer in a church, a final goodbye beside a dying family member was enough to pass the invisible killer. Doctors, those who remained, were terrified. They stood over patients wearing long cloaks, leather gloves, and strange bird-like masks filled with herbs and spices, but nothing helped. Not the perfumes, not the prayers, not the fires burning in every town square. Cities tried desperate measures. Some sealed their gates and refused entry to anyone, even their own citizens. Others forced the sick into isolation houses, marked with red crosses on the doors. And many places simply collapsed into chaos. Bodies began to pile faster than they could be buried. Gravediggers abandoned their posts. Priests died by the dozens every week, and entire families were found lifeless inside shuttered homes. Rumors spread like wildfire. The air is poisoned. The stars have shifted. Witches are behind this. Strangers carry the curse. Fear grew into anger, and anger turned into violence. But nothing stopped what was coming. The Black Death was no longer a distant threat. It was tightening its grip on Europe, city by city, village by village, breath by breath. As the plague continued its relentless spread, Europe desperately searched for answers. But the more people tried to stop the disease, the more hopeless their situation became. Doctors trained in ancient Greek and Roman medicine were powerless. Many wore long robes, leather gloves, and strange bird-like masks stuffed with herbs. believing sweet smells could block the poison in the air. They were wrong. Flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public squares, convinced that humanity's sins had brought divine punishment. Crowds gathered to watch them bleed, hoping repentance would save them. It did nothing. Some communities turned on minorities, foreigners, travelers, and especially Jewish families, accusing them of poisoning wells. Fear twisted into violence. Entire communities were exiled, attacked, or burned. Yet the plague continued untouched. Trade routes collapsed, markets emptied, fields rotted as farmers died in their homes, leaving no one to harvest the crops. And for the first time, people began to wonder, was this the end of the world? As the plague tightened its grip across Europe, fear began to reshape daily life in ways never seen before. People stopped trusting one another. Families avoided neighbors. Doors were bolted, windows were shuttered, and entire streets fell into unnatural silence. Markets once filled with noise and trade now echoed like empty halls. Priests walked cautiously, holding cloths to their faces. Doctors, those who dared to remain, wore long-beaked masks stuffed with herbs, hoping the scent would protect them from the poisoned air. But nothing helped. The miasma theory, the belief that bad air caused disease, pushed people to burn incense and carry flowers. Others lit fires in their homes, believing smoke would cleanse the sickness. None of it worked, and so desperation grew. In towns across Germany, France, and Italy, groups known as flagellants emerged. Hundreds marched from village to village, beating their own backs with chains and whips, believing their pain could convince God to end the plague. Crowds gathered to watch them, half in awe, half in terror. But everywhere the flagellants marched, the plague soon followed. Their gatherings, their ceremonies, their closeness only helped spread the disease faster. Authorities eventually banned them, but by then the damage was done. The Black Death was no longer just a disease. It had become a force reshaping societies, beliefs, economies, and even faith itself. Europe was beginning to understand. This was not a passing illness. This was a world-changing catastrophe. As the plague spread deeper into Europe, fear began reshaping society in ways never seen before. People abandoned traditions, customs, and even basic humanity. Doctors stopped visiting patients, teachers closed their schools, judges halted trials, and merchants refused to handle coins, believing they carried death. Communities turned inward. Some villages blocked their roads with fallen trees, refusing entry to any stranger. Others formed patrols-armed groups who kept watch day and night, desperate to keep the disease out. Yet nothing could stop it. Messengers carried letters, contaminated. Priests traveled between homes, unknowingly spreading the plague. And rats, hidden in cargo and grain stores, slipped past every barricade. In many towns, the sick were left behind as families fled to the countryside. But even the open fields offered no safety because the plague traveled with them. Soon, Europe began to understand a terrifying truth. You could run from the Black Death, but you could not escape it. But here is something people never expected, something that terrified even the doctors who had survived months surrounded by death. The plague was changing. At first, it struck the body, but now it began to attack the lungs. A new form appeared. Whispers spread through villages. They called it the invisible killer, because unlike the bubonic form, this one left no warning buboes, no swollen lumps, no visible sign of disaster. Instead, a sharp pain in the chest, a cough small at first, then dark blood on the cloth, and within hours, the lungs collapsed. People died the same day the cough appeared. And the most terrifying part? It spread through the air. One breath, one conversation, one shared room. That was enough. Families who lived together for years vanished within a single night. Entire streets fell silent before sunrise. Doors stayed shut, windows were nailed closed, but nothing stopped the invisible wind carrying death from house to house. Scholars wrote that it seemed as if the very air had turned poisonous, and in a way, it had. The Black Death was no longer just a plague. It had become something far more ruthless, a force that hunted breath itself. And yet, the worst chapter was still to come. In the warm spring of 1348, something terrifying happened in Florence. At first, it was only whispers. Merchants spoke of strange deaths on the docks. Travelers told stories of entire villages disappearing along the trade roads. Most people ignored it. After all, Florence was powerful, rich, proud, untouchable. But the plague didn't care. It slipped through the city gates quietly, carried by a single traveler, a single rat, a single flea. And then, Florence began to crumble. Within days, the narrow streets filled with the sound of coughing. Houses that once overflowed with laughter became silent. Servants fled their masters' homes. Mothers abandoned sick children. Children abandoned dying parents. Even the city's rulers panicked. Meetings were canceled. Records left unfinished. Laws forgotten. People searched for answers. Was it a curse? A punishment? A poison in the air? Priests walked the streets chanting prayers. But many collapsed before finishing the final words. Doctors tried their strange remedies. Burning herbs, bleeding veins, covering buboes with strange oils. Nothing worked. Shops closed. Markets emptied. Streets were so quiet that birds could be heard for the first time in years. And then came the smell of thousands of bodies, left in homes, in alleys, in churches. So many died that the city ran out of places to bury them. Mass graves were dug outside the walls, deep pits where men dumped bodies quickly and fled. Florence, the jewel of Italy, a city of art, trade, and beauty, was now a place of fear. But the most haunting part? The plague was not done, not even close. It would return again and again, each time taking more than before. And as Florence fell silent, the rest of Europe realized something terrifying. No city, no matter how strong, could escape what was coming. As the plague tightened its grip on Europe, something unsettling began to happen. Something no chronicler could fully explain. Cities didn't fall with loud battles or burning walls. They fell in silence. Streets that once echoed with merchants and children became so quiet that a single cough could carry across entire districts. And yet, the terror grew louder in every mind. People whispered of ghostly carts moving at night, collecting bodies before dawn. Some claimed to hear soft knocking on doors, a knock no one wanted to answer, because if the knock came for your home, someone inside had already died. Entire households vanished behind locked shutters. Neighbors avoided passing each other on the streets, and priests, once fearless, now walked with trembling hands, anointing the dying while trying not to breathe too deeply. Farmers abandoned their fields, markets emptied, ships rotted in harbors because no crew dared sail them. Europe was not collapsing from war, but from absence, an emptying, a quiet unraveling of life itself. And still, the plague moved forward, as if following a path no human could see. But the darkest chapters were still ahead. As panic spread, people searched desperately for answers, but the more they looked, the darker the truth became. Some blamed the stars, believing a great cosmic alignment had poisoned the air. Others accused foreigners, outsiders, or even wandering strangers. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor, city against city. But beneath the confusion, something far more terrifying was happening. The plague was no longer moving with ships and caravans. It was spreading on the wind. What began in silent ports was now sweeping across continents, slipping through shutters, seeping under doors, finding the weakest, the strongest, the richest, the poorest, and pulling them all into the same darkness. Europe tried to defend itself. But how do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you run from death when death travels faster than you? And with every passing day, the shadow of the Black Death grew larger, as if the continent itself was holding its breath. waiting for the next city to fall. Across Europe, a quiet fear began to settle into the hearts of the people. Not the fear of sudden death. That fear had long passed. This was something different, a heavy, suffocating sense that the world itself was changing. Travelers returning from distant towns carried the same haunted look. They spoke of villages where grass grew over doorsteps, of wells left untouched, of markets where the only sound was the wind pushing empty stalls. And then came the rumors. Rumors of places where the plague behaved differently. Some said it struck without warning. No fever, no buboes, just a faint dizziness, a stumble, and then collapse. Others whispered about the second breath, a stage of sickness far worse than the first. Victims gasped for air, their lungs filling as if they were drowning from the inside. Doctors called it the pestilence of the lungs. People called it the death you could hear coming, because in the stillness of night, whole streets could hear the coughing. Harsh, tearing, endless coughing that echoed between the stone walls until suddenly, everything went quiet, and whenever the coughing stopped, neighbors knew another household had been erased. Yet, despite the terror, the plague brought an eerie sameness across cities and kingdoms. Rich or poor, farmer or noble, believer or skeptic, no one was untouchable. Fear became the great equalizer. Silence became the shared language of survival. And through all of this, the people asked the same question: if this continues, what will be left of the world we once knew? The Black Death was not just killing bodies. It was reshaping societies, breaking traditions, and rewriting the memory of an entire continent. And the worst part? No one knew how far it would go, or when it would stop. Across Europe, one city after another had already fallen, but some places were still untouched. And in those untouched cities, fear became its own kind of infection. Merchants returning from the ports were questioned endlessly. Travelers were inspected at the gates. People whispered to each other, "Has it reached us? Did anyone die suddenly? Is this the week our city disappears?" Doctors prepared herbs and poultices that they knew would not work, but doing something felt better than doing nothing. Priests delivered sermons about repentance. Astrologers blamed the alignment of the planets. Parents kept their children inside, barricading doors as if the plague were a physical enemy. But deep inside, everyone felt the same chilling truth. The Black Death was not a question of if, it was a question of when. Some cities tried desperate measures: close the markets, seal the wells, burn incense in the streets, pray until their voices cracked in the night. But nothing slowed the inevitable. Every rumor, every distant bell, every caravan arriving from another town felt like a warning. They were waiting not for rescue, but for the moment the invisible shadow would finally reach them. And it always did. As the plague tightened its grip on Europe, people became desperate for answers. How could something unseen, something silent, kill so quickly? Physicians searched their books, their scrolls, their ancient teachings, but nothing matched what they were witnessing. Some blamed the alignment of the planets, saying Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had twisted the air itself. Some blamed miasma, a poisonous fog drifting through streets, and some blamed sin, believing the plague was a punishment that no medicine could cure. And yet, behind all the fear and superstition, a few minds started noticing patterns. The plague followed the trade routes. It hit crowded towns first. It moved with travelers, with goods, with ships. It killed the poor and the wealthy just the same. It ignored walls, locks, borders, and prayers. For the first time, Europe realized this was not a curse. It was a force of nature, and no one truly understood it. But while scholars argued, the plague continued its silent work, slipping through cities, haunting villages, stealing breath after breath. And the worst part? The dead were no longer the only victims. The living were starting to break. As the winter of 1348 deepened, the plague no longer moved like a wave. It moved like a shadow, silent, unpredictable, impossible to outrun. Villages that had once echoed with children's laughter now stood completely still. Doors hung open, fires burned out in empty hearths. Animals